Hello, welcome to Secure the Continent with me, Benga Aborowa. This is the program where we bring you up to speed with all the security happenings on the African continent. But before we get into our main topic of discussion today, let me first bring you the major security headlines across Africa. Nigerian Rights Commission to probe army over allegations of forced abortions. At least 27 farmers killed in South Sudan in a deadly revenge attack by cattle keepers. South African peoples go on rampage over death of schoolmates. And security agents arrest suspects over death of Cameroonian journalists. Don't go anywhere. I will be right back. Today on Secure the Continent, we will be revisiting Cameroon's Anglophone crisis. Cameroon's government says it has not asked any country to mediate its conflict with separatists, apparently denying a statement from Canada that it had been assigned to work on a peace process. Let's give you a background of the crisis and the situation in Cameroon. There are details for you in this package.
The separatists have grown in stature, ranks, and have become one of Cameroon's most enduring security challenges. The men from Ambazonia, as the minority English-speaking part of the country is called, have been a thorn in the flesh of the Cameroonian government. They have pushed for a referendum to determine their independence as a nation, but the Central African nation, led by octogenarian Paul Biya, has refused such arrangements. Nearly 800,000 people have been displaced in Ambazonia's southwest and northwestern regions since the troubles started, and more than 600,000 children do not have access to education as schools have remained shut in the country. Thousands have died in their battle for a republic. With recent entreaties by Canada denied by the Cameroon government, the end to this brotherly war is unknown, and both parties have so far stayed rooted to their resolve. The Cameroonian government says it has not entrusted any foreign country or external entity with any role of mediator or facilitator to settle the crisis. It is one of Africa's biggest challenges, but there has been little to no interventions by the African Union. Although what's in stock is unclear, what's clear is that Cameroon's Anglophone crisis needs a solution before it blows out of control.
Now, joining me on the program today to discuss this is Aga Wifru, a security analyst who joins me from the Cameroonian capital, Yaoundé. I also have David Otto, the director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, who joins us from the Nigerian capital city, Abuja. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Secure the Continent.
Thank you very much, Benga. It's always a pleasure to be here.
We're happy to have you both. Now, I'd like to start with you, Argonwi. Can you give us a detailed explanation of the historical and political context that has led to the current crisis in Cameroon's Anglophone regions, and how has it evolved over the years?
Thank you very much for that question. And I first of all want to appreciate the brilliant report that I just saw. The Anglophone crisis, which has evolved into the conflict, is a very deep-rooted problem. Anglophones have always felt like they are part of a country that doesn't consider them equals with the Francophone. And taking us back to history, we all can recall that in 1961, there was this United Nations plebiscite where Anglophones, or the Southern Cameroonians at the time, were allowed to gain their independence either by joining Nigeria or by joining French Cameroon. And so we voted to join French Cameroon. And initially we had this federal union wherein the Anglophones still had some sort of autonomy managing their institutions. But then in 1972, President Ahidjo at the time met with some Anglophone leaders, notably John Gulfoncha and a host of others, at the Fumban conference for discussions around a unified nation, no longer the federal system. And quickly after that, Cameroon transitioned from a federal republic to a united republic. And at this time, several Anglophone institutions, notably the House of Chiefs, the Coffee and Cocoa Corporation, or the Cocoa Coffee Board, and a host others, were taken over by the government. And later on, these institutions declared bankruptcy and were subsequently closed down. Even the Anglophone educational system was kind of infiltrated or integrated with that of the Francophone system, and a host of other measures were taken by the government to solidify the reunification, the country's reunification. But only that rather intensified the grievances of the Anglophones, because slowly but surely, many families lost their source of livelihood, and that Anglophones felt like the national cake was not evenly shared. Anglophones felt like they received little economic resources.
Because of time, how did this conflict, as we know today, come to a head? When did they pick up guns, the separatists, and evolve into this devastating conflict that we've seen today? At what point?
Okay. All right. Well, what I was talking about was more of like the political grievances that led to what we are facing today. Because if you're talking about the immediate cause of the conflict, then I would say that the crisis, the political crisis, which I was describing earlier on, evolved or metamorphosed into a conflict in 2017, notably. But it was all as a result of trade union protests, and I'll say peaceful protests that started in October 2016. And these were championed by lawyers and teachers' trade unions. And they were decrying, once again, the marginalization of Anglophone institutions, notably the schools and the courts, with the appointment of Francophone teachers and judges all over the place, and the gradual disappearance of Anglophone heritage. And because these protests were so prominent, they were met by brutal force from the government. You had police and gendarmes crack down on protesting teachers and lawyers all through 2016. And in 2017, the civil society decided to join this protest. Anglophones went out as one with peace plans to protest against the government's response to their cries. And this time again, notably in October 2017, in September 2017, I beg your pardon, there was this harsh crackdown on Anglophone protesters. Many of them were arrested, many were killed, and many have been declared missing to date. And that was, I can say, the last straw on the camel's back, because from October 2017, you had groups of Anglophones who decided to take up arms and defend themselves. So that is actually a brief summary of what has led to the conflict, the full-blown civil war that we are experiencing today, Benga.
Let me bring in David Alto from Abuja. Now, David, we've seen this conflict has been raging since 2016, and not so much has been done in terms of putting an end to this. And it came to a lot of observers recently as a shock that the Cameroonian government's statement denying asking Canada to mediate in the Anglophone conflict. Quite a bizarre situation, if you ask me. So was there an error in communication, and how did this all play out?
Benga, thank you for that. Before I dive into the current situation as regards to the statement by the Minister for Communication, Renee Sadi, denying that the government was involved in any kind of mediation or directed Canada to be involved. I think it's worth mentioning that my co-panelist Achengwi made a very good analysis of the background and the history, and it's very important to recognize that the current situation that the conflict is experiencing now has a lot to do with that background history. And, I mean, therefore, in terms of the way forward, which of course is, one of the reasons why the government is talking about not involving or not dedicating any country, there has been previous engagements, particularly by the government of Switzerland. They call that the Swiss process, which this was another form of mediation and facilitation process that the government clearly did not show any interest. Previously, the government itself, has tried what it called the Grand National Dialogue, in which case it did invite mostly key stakeholders within Cameroon. But one of the criticisms of that Grand National Dialogue was and has been that most of the key stakeholders who happen to be in the diaspora were not included in that dialogue, and therefore, even when the government came up with what they called a special status, some kind of a solution to neutralize and to calm down nerves of some of the separatist groups, that did not happen. We've got to be very clear here, Benga, that there are several factions, within the so-called Anglophone movement or the Ambazonia movement. I mean, there are factions that clearly do want a secession, without any reconsideration. There are sides that are talking about a federal state, meaning that they want to go back to what actually we talked about, which is the pre-1972, which, again, was the time when both the so-called West Cameroon merged with the East Cameroon, which is currently La République du Cameroon and the British or the former British Southern Cameroon. So there are several factions. There are people who do want the status quo to remain the same. They do want some form of decentralization of power, from the central situation that it is now in the capital, Yaoundé. So essentially, what the government has been doing in the previous 2 or 3 years is to try and preach, a policy of unity and saying that it is working towards a decentralization. So they came up with this Grand National Dialogue, which they called an internal solution to the problem. But the biggest issue with that is that most of the separatist groups, have not been involved in that. So hence, the reason why, you're talking about a process out of the country, which of course, as you rightly said, the Canadian government, put itself forward to mediate between the government and some of the Ambazonia separatist forces. Now, the issue with this particular process is that even within the government itself, there are divisions or what I call factions. Some elements within the government, they want to have a decentralization, and some elements prefer that, this process can be, stopped by, using the military force. Other elements believe that the only way that, this crisis can end is if, there is some kind of an internationally mediated settlement, which of course is what the government of Canada, came, to do. But surprisingly or shockingly to the international community, but not to Cameroonians who understand how the government works, the Minister for Communication came very strongly and said, they were not aware or they did not give any powers or any blessings, or knew anything to do with this mediation and facilitation process. So clearly, I think, what needs to be known here very clearly is that there are two main factions within the government. One that believes that, this can be a negotiated settlement, and perhaps, another faction from maybe the Minister of Communication that believes, the only way to end this crisis is either through the battlefield or through what they call, implementing the outcome of the Grand National Dialogue. So that is where we are at this point in time. But the danger, I have to mention this, is that what we clearly have now is the separatist forces saying that they do not know which part of the government to speak to. And the government, kind of coming back to what the government used to say before, that because the separatists were not united, it did not have anyone to speak to. So there is disunity in terms of purpose and goal between the separatists and also between the government of Cameroon as it stands.
Alto for that. Now, I would like you to pick up from where David left off. So we have a situation, we have a stalemate, we have a catch-22 situation. On both sides of the divide, there are also divisions. David talked about the hardliners in the Ambazonia movement, and also those that are willing to give dialogue a chance. And also on the government side, you have government hardliners that feel, we need a military solution to this. And also those who feel, we can get results through a negotiated settlement. So how do we get out of this quagmire? And do you think by having an international mediator, it could start working towards finding a solution to this crisis? How do you get all sides to agree on something?
Yeah, just like David, I do think that there needs to be a very how do I put it, an inclusive dialogue. And yes, I do think that there is need for a mediator, a third-party mediator. It could be another country, just like Canada is coming in today, but why not the United Nations? Because I was talking about history a few minutes ago, and I made mention of the plebiscite that took place in 1961. Today, we need another plebiscite. I do think that if the United Nations, the same United Nations that asked the people of Southern Cameroon to vote whether they wanted to join Nigeria or they wanted to gain independence by joining French Cameroon, should come in. I think the only way to solve this is by giving the people, letting the people's voice be heard, giving the people the chance to choose what they want their destiny to be. In 1961, a choice was made, and several years after, people are realizing that it was a huge mistake. And not just several years, I mean, immediately.
Sorry to interrupt you, Agawi. Do you think the central government in Yaoundé would allow for that if that was an option to have a referendum to see if the people want to stay with Cameroon or be independent?
I think the government would obviously not want that, because the government has been preaching this idea or ideology of a one and indivisible Cameroon. But I would say that that is really a cosmetic political fix, because it doesn't reflect the realities on the ground. And I think that is one of the reasons why the government came up to say, we didn't ask Canada or any other body to intervene for us. Because the government, I think they fear that that is one of the topics that will be put on the table, and that is definitely something the government doesn't want to talk about. But then, does it? I mean, in times like this, it doesn't really matter about what you want to talk about and what you don't want to talk about. People are dying, and we need a solution. We need peace, and I think both parties should really be open-minded. The government also should really be open-minded and understand that this is a time that people have to be allowed to make the choice on what actually they want to be, or what they want this nation to become.
People should be allowed to take control of their destiny, says Agawi. Now, David Wright's group, Amnesty International, said the militants have also committed atrocities. Apart from killing members of the security forces, they've also carried out attacks designed to strike fear amongst the population, going as far as burning down schools and targeting teachers who did not enforce the boycott, Amnesty International said in a report. What are the local sentiments on the ground in this Anglophone regions? Are the people in support of this secessionist armed struggle?
There is a mixed bag, and as somebody who's involved in conflict resolution, conflict management, I know 100% that once you allow a conflict or a war to break out beyond negotiation and dialogue, then what you get inevitably is that.
Okay, I think we lost David. Before we get David back online, I'll just like to direct that question to Agawi. What's the local sentiment on the ground in the Anglophone regions? Are they in support of the secessionist armed struggle?
That answer is not an answer, a yes or no kind of answer, because you have lots of nuances in this crisis, Benga. It's really difficult to use blanket statements when talking about people's sentiments with regards to the crisis. And yes, Amnesty International is right by saying that the separatist movement has committed atrocities. They have burned down schools, they have kidnapped people, they have even killed people. Yes, that is a reality. But then, does that mean that the sentiments on the ground from the population is that of hatred? I would say not really, because you do have in some instances where people frown against the actions of the separatists, and you even have people denouncing the actions of the separatists on one hand, but on the other hand, when the separatists have a big hit against the military, you find people jubilating. You still find people who are convinced that the boys are doing the right thing and that this conflict needed to get to this level to actually get the results that the people want. So it is a mixed situation. Yes, people are suffering in the hands of the separatists, but also on one hand, you have people who feel like it is okay, it is the collateral of the crisis, and that as long as they get to where they are going to, which is independence or autonomy of the regions, then this is the price that they have to pay.
Thank you, Agowi. Now, David, this conflict has been dragging for quite some time, and I do know that some of the locals would have felt this conflict fatigue that has been going on for too long, and they're not seeing independence on the horizon. And as a result of that, changed their minds and their support. Of course, the behavior of some of the separatists to burning schools and killing those that are sympathetic to Yaoundé's cause also contributes to this. So what's the local sentiments on the ground?
Yes, you're right. I mean, sorry for that interruption in terms of my network. When conflicts, go on for a very long time, and governments know this very well, there is a tendency for people to pull out because of conflict fatigue, or because perhaps they believe that they can no longer achieve what their goals and objectives are, in terms of what they want out of the conflict. But again, there are people who believe that war is something that in order for you to get what you want, you need to show that element of extremism, and this is why there is still a continuation of the separatist movement. And I know firsthand that without the support of the local population, or some of the local population, no movement can survive, because of course, they need protection, from the local population. So that is very indicative, bring out the fact that as long as the separatist groups, continue on fighting on ground, it clearly means that, one, they do have the support of some of the people within the local population. It means that they continuously believe in the cause of achieving an independence. It means that they continuously have support, to buy weapons, to train their fighters, to have some, motivation, psychological upkeep, in order for them to continue fighting. So it's very important to, not, put all the local population in one box, but to understand that, people will change minds or ideas, as the conflict continues to go on. My understanding, of this is that it tells me very clearly that there is a need for the government not to rely squarely on, using hardline measures, using the military or the police tactics. Because, of course, after years of fighting, this will go nowhere. It will be a war of attrition. So I believe very much that there is a need for the government to come to the negotiation table and find a common ground, because, of course, the very challenging aspect of this conflict is that, the conflict has about 3 or 4 dimensions. One, the government has to deal with the separatists who are on ground in Cameroon. They have to deal with the separatists that are in the diaspora, who have a very powerful voice. They have to deal with themselves, with the fact that, the government disagrees in terms of how to approach it. But, lastly, they have to deal with the pressure from the international community. And that brings me very squarely to the point which you mentioned earlier on. I think in order to bring the government to the table, they need a very powerful guarantor. That could be the United Nations. But we've got to bear in mind, Benga, that Cameroon is a sovereign state. And therefore, even the way that the United Nations responds to the conflict, it comes with some level of respect, to the territorial integrity of Cameroon, because, of course, the separatists are not yet the country. So I think what we need, beyond the government of Canada being a mediator or a negotiator, is to have, some kind of a powerful guarantor. It could be the United Nations, it could be any other country. I know very well that the Vatican is so much interested in ensuring that there is some level of peace. I mean, we've seen, the Pope traveling to DRC Congo recently and today in the South Sudan. So it tells you that, the Roman Catholic Church or the Pope could play a very key role in actually putting not both sides, but all sides, however you want to label that, so that, people can come to the negotiation table. But it is beyond a national solution as the government sees it.
Thank you very much, David. A fine place to go on a break. When we come back, we will be preferring solutions, looking at solutions to ending this Anglophone crisis in Cameroon. You're watching Secure the Continent. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to Secure the Continent. Thank you for staying with us. If you're just joining, we've been discussing the Cameroon Anglophone crisis, and we have right here with us, we still have Agangwe Fu, security analyst, and David Otto, director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies. Now, we've been discussing this issue. We've looked at the background to it, the current situation, but let's look at the consequences and the effects of this conflict on the people in the region. Now, Agangwe, can you discuss the socioeconomic impact of the conflict on the Anglophone regions and its people? How has it affected essential services such as healthcare, education, and livelihoods? And what is the current situation in these Anglophone regions?
Yes, Benga, the conflict has had a terrible impact on the population in every sphere, of the society, in any domain you can think of, from socially to economically and even religiously. There has been a tremendous impact on the population. I'll start by socially. Anglophones are naturally very hospitable people, and they're very sociable people, always going out, communing together, gathering together for events, be they happy events or sad events. But this conflict has brought a lot of suspicion amongst people, because you no longer know who you're dealing with. You don't know if X or Y is a government affiliate or an Amazonian informant. It's very, very easy to be termed a black leg, and it's also very easy to be termed a terrorist, just based on your simple interactions. So that has made people so suspicious, and it has killed the camaraderie that used to exist in communities. Also, you've had a lot of sad events. Many people have lost loved ones, and many people are highly affected. People have lost their homes, people have lost their sources of livelihood. So in general, the standard of living has hugely dropped. And recently we are also experiencing a hike in prices. Everything, especially foodstuff, is extremely expensive, because the mothers, the farmers, can no longer go to their farms because either they are scared of being targeted by the military or scared of being targeted on the other hand, by separatist fighters. It's extremely difficult to have food to eat, and when you find food to eat, it's extremely expensive. So the quality of life has dropped a lot. Education has been hugely impacted. Before the crisis, Bamenda used to be Cameroon's educational capital. It means when you want to talk about good schools in Cameroon, you come to Bamenda. But that has gradually disappeared because most schools were shut down for a very long time, and even till date, students cannot go to school in uniforms. You have to hide. So many lockdowns, and there was a huge crackdown on students and teachers at the beginning of the crisis, and that has hugely impacted education as a whole. Healthcare, we don't even talk about that because it is highly deplorable. Several health centers, especially those in the suburbs, have been shut down or are in lack of personnel. Many people no longer want to go and work in the villages or even in Bamenda town because it is insecure. So the quality of healthcare services has greatly dropped. You have the humanitarian organizations that are trying to have an impact, but then it is still not easy. Doctors Without Borders, which was playing a tremendous role in providing healthcare services, especially the people in the suburbs, was suspended by the government for reasons we know very little about. In the Southwest region, they were forced to leave because the government would not allow them to work objectively. So all of this is making life extremely difficult, I will tell you. Coupled with the general inflation that we're all going through, life is a hell in this part of the world, Benga.
Not a pretty situation, and that's why we're having this discussions to see if we could prefer solutions to changing the lot of those that are leaving and are caught in this protracted conflict. Now, David, beyond the government's high-sounding slogans of one united, indivisible Cameroon, what efforts has the Cameroonian government put in place to address these historical issues of perceived marginalization of the English-speaking community? And how have these efforts been received by the Anglophone separatist groups and the general population in the Anglophone regions?
Bega, right. You know there's a war going on, and when we talk about a solution, what we're talking about is that we want things to at least go back to the last known good, and perhaps go further than that in terms of addressing some of the underlying causes, which my co-panelist has mentioned very well in terms of the marginalization that the Anglophones have cried for years about. I mean, of course, there are several solutions and several views in terms of how these solutions should look like. You and I, or the international community, what we want to see is we want to see a return, of peace, between these two parties. But what is the nature of that? That's the very most important element. What does peace look like, for the government of Cameroon? What does it look like for the Anglophones, or the separatists, or the federalists, or the people that are advocating for a 10-state federation? Because again, you've got to be very clear here. There is no one particular voice in terms of how the solution should look like. There's no golden bullet solution, to make that very clear. But what people want to see is a return to peace. Now, the government clearly understands, perhaps they do, or maybe they don't, that the continuous military solution will not work. I mean, Aga mentioned a lot of the effects of this war. I think one thing that she did not mention is the fact that even within the military and the security agencies themselves, there is a high level of suspicion between the people within the military who speak English or who come from the so-called Anglophone region, or the northwest and southwest regions, as is in the current dispensation. There is a high level of suspicion. People within the military do not want to be deployed to go to these areas because, of course, they understand that this is an asymmetric warfare. It becomes very easy for them to be targeted, using guerrilla tactics, by the separatist forces. So there is no win-win in this situation. Now, from the government's perspective, as I mentioned earlier on, one aspect is that there is a faction, and one faction wants to resolve this crisis through the military force, and that is why, Benga, we still see that the military is being deployed, is being recruited to fight the separatists on the ground. Perhaps this is a normal government strategy. You apply the what we call the stick and the carrot at the same time. There is a clear faction. One aspect of one side of the government wants to see some kind of a negotiated settlement. Maybe this is, also, just we have the stick on one hand and we have the carrot on one hand. So there are different goals in terms of what the government wants. In terms of what the separatists want, it's the same thing. The separatist forces, do you want to have an independence? They want that to happen through first of all, stages of referendum. They want to have, the Anglophones to decide on whether they want to, be on their own or they want to continue with the current structure. Some of the separatists, some of the federalists, as they call them, do you want to see a return to the two-state federation which existed, before 1972? They want to see that happen. Others want to see some kind of a decentralization. A good example is what we now have in Nigeria, where you have each state governor almost independent, but still you have some level of control at the federal government side, maybe controlling the police or the military. So, there are factions that do want that. So overall, there is no one solution. But the overwhelming, separatist groups, do talk about the need for them to have a independent Ambazonia state. But because both sides, are coming onto a negotiation table, I bet the government denying in some aspects that it doesn't have anything to do with the Canadian process, they call it. It's a very clear indication that there is some level of flexibility. So I believe that either the separatists who are on the table are ready to be flexible, but I don't know how that flexibility is going to look like, or the government that says one and indivisible, perhaps they are also ready to be flexible, but yet we do not know how that flexibility is going to look like. So, there are several factions, there are several angles to look at this, but it's not a one, solution. I cannot say, and there is no one who can say, this is what is going to happen. But let talks begin, let negotiations begin, let dialogue begin. And then we can be able, through some level of transparency, with a very critical and powerful guarantor, we can be able to see perhaps that some level of normalcy will return. But what is normalcy is down to the actors.
Thank you, David. Now, Agar, I'd like to pick up from where David left off. Still tinkering and looking at potential solutions. He did mention something that struck a chord. The ideas of a loose federation and greater autonomy. So my question is this: are there and what are the potential benefits of granting greater autonomy to communes and regions in resolving the conflict and achieving peace? Could it be a possible win-win solution, a negotiated settlement for both sides?
It could be. It could be, but then I think it requires a lot of trust. People need to be able to trust the government for that to happen. But at this point in time, people do not trust the government. And I don't think it's only an issue of Anglophones, even the Francophones, even in the Francophone regions. Cameroon is going through a serious political crisis in general. There is this general distrust against the government. And that is why those who are advocating for federalism keep on being on the minority, because people start asking, is this government capable of respecting the principles of federalism? Should that be arrived at? And there's a huge question mark there, Benga, because the government that we have is one that has a strategy of being slow on everything and allowing you to get tired along the line, and still at the end of the day having no changes. So federalism could be an option if it is respected to the letter, if it is really respected and well implemented. Yes, I think it could be, because Anglophones believe that they have a lot of resources. If well exploited and managed, it could give so many jobs to Tico WAF and a lot of others that used to exist but that were taken over, bankrupt, and shut down immediately the government came in. Anglophones are hardworking people, and they have the potential to make good use of their resources and manage them adequately. I do believe that federalism is a good option, but then it should properly managed.
Thank you, Aga. David, again, we did mention issues of trust. And in the course of our conversation tonight, you've also talked about having a strong guarantor. So what kind of support and assistance is needed from the international community to effectively address and resolve the crisis in Cameroon? How can the international community support the peace process and ensure long-term stability and reconciliation in the Anglophone regions post-conflict?
Brother, you're right. I think when it comes to the international community, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. The international community exists because individual countries exist. And there's what you call the doctrine of sovereignty and national integrity, which of course the Cameroon government has plenty. And what does that mean? It means that the international community can only come to Cameroon's aid if, for example, Cameroon shows a lot of interest or shows that support for a negotiated settlement. Like we've seen lately, the government has denied that it mandated Canada to have these talks. That could potentially be a catalyst that will destroy the entire process that has been ongoing in secrecy. Because of course, effectively what the government of Cameroon is saying, through its Minister of Communication, Renee Sadi, is that, whatever you're talking about does not exist. So, the international community, if I may say, I mean, a lot of people will talk about the UN because it's the largest body. The UN, has this principle of respecting the individual sovereignty of each state. And because Cameroon is a member of the United Nations, it does enjoy that. So I think, the first point of call has to be, well, what is it that the Cameroon government really wants? And how does it see this conflict end? But the other side is it has to be in terms of, how resilient and how much persistence that, the so-called separatists, do have, the Ambazonians, in terms of how long do they, how long can they withstand the superior might of the Cameroon military on the battlefield. Now, if they could withstand that over years and they're prepared to do that, then perhaps it could push the Cameroon government to say, well, if this is not going to end in the battlefield, then we must find a way of resolving it, because no country wants to continuously be in conflict. Remember, Cameroon is already experiencing a conflict since 2012, with the so-called ISIS in West Africa province of Boko Haram, yes, with the Nigerian borders. It does have crisis in the western side, with the borders with Central African Republic. And of course, it has been made worse by the recent COVID-19 and other economic challenges which the country is experiencing because of this conflict. So, nobody wants to have a war fought, in their backyard or under their administration for that long a time. So I think, in order for the international community to really step in, it has to be by the determination of the government of Cameroon to, put his hands and say, we are happy for you to get help, or by the determination of the separatists to say, we will fight until when, some kind of a negotiated settlement comes to the table. So it doesn't stay in one hand. It's not about what the international community thinks. It is about the behavior of both parties as far as this conflict is concerned.
Very, very important. Now, Aga, before we wrap up today's conversation, recently it was in the news of the assassination of a Cameroonian journalist. So how has the conflict impacted freedom of expression and media in the Anglophone regions? What steps have been taken to ensure the safety of journalists and freedom of the press in the region?
Yeah, I was on mute. Benga, talking about the freedom of the press, I'd say that at the beginning, the government, journalists, today you have Mancho BBC, who is behind bars. He's a journalist. It's true that he wasn't arrested because he's a journalist, but he was arrested because he was actually out on the street advocating for a change. And you have other journalists that have been taken in by arrested and locked up by the government for speaking out about this crisis. But also, I think the criticism that the government has received has greatly helped too, because at the same time you have the law on terrorism that has been instituted by the government, wherein just talking about things that the government deems inappropriate, you could be easily termed as a terrorist. So it has I would say it has really watered down to a greater extent the freedom with which people can actually talk about the crisis. And Anglophones even believe that.
I'm afraid we can't. This is how much we can take. I wish we could go on. I would like to say a big thank you to you, Anglophone security analyst, who joined us from Yaoundé in Cameroon, and also David Otto, Director for Geneva Center for Africa Security and Strategic Studies, who joined us from the Nigerian capital, Abuja. I'd like to say thank you to you both for your time and contribution to the program.
Thank you for having us.